BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays, I talk to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And in this episode, I will be responding to the criminal profile for D.B. Cooper created by Robert Fuller, re-examining Wolfgang Gossett as a D.B. Cooper suspect, and of course continuing with the Cooper Profile segment, which is all about the psychological profiling of skyjackers. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. So I think this is going to be one of the episodes where the intro materials and the Cooper Profile segment meet. I usually conclude the Cooper Friday segment by talking to you guys about the psychological profiling of skyjackers, which mostly goes through the writings of Dr. David G. Hubbard, who wrote 2 books about this, The Skyjacker and Winning Back the Sky. But this is one where everything is going to intersect, because I had an opportunity to listen to the criminal profiler Robert Fuller, who appeared on the Cooper Vortex. And I've heard a lot of episodes of the Cooper Vortex in the past, and I even told you guys that that used to be my weekend show, Saturday and Sunday mornings, just starting with an episode of the Cooper Vortex while I was drinking the morning coffee. And I don't know how I missed this one, but I found it. It's about 3 years old, and I decided to listen to Robert Fuller and his observations about D.B. Cooper. And there were some amazing statements that were made by him. Firstly, D.B. Cooper skyjacked a plane going from Portland to Seattle. He handed notes to the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, saying that he had a bomb, and he ultimately demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. And Robert Fuller began his criminal profile presentation by saying something that I had never exactly heard from anyone in these specific words, that he thought that D.B. Cooper had either planned on going to seminary or maybe he went to a seminary himself. And I'm like, wow, that's really interesting that he would say that, because it's his demeanor, his mannerisms, the way that he's interacting with the flight attendants. It's perhaps even his personality, although we can't study D.B. Cooper's personality firsthand, but I thought that was a really interesting observation. And the second one that also blew me away was that he said that D.B. Cooper had a very strong attachment to objects, where maybe he cared more about objects than he did about people, not in a cold way, but in an almost obsessive way, because he asked for the notes back. And he also used a matchbook to have Tina Mucklow, the other flight attendant, light matches so he could smoke his cigarettes. But he wanted the matchbook back, and that might be as simple as, well, he didn't want any evidence left behind. He didn't want things traced back to him. But Robert Fuller seemed to think that it was going in a different direction. He seemed to think that this guy had a very strong connection to objects. And this is one that I've actually dealt with firsthand. And it was actually music to my ears once when I was listening to an old episode of Howard Stern. And Howard was saying that he had OCD. He has OCD. And even when he was a disc jockey, when he had to play music, he would feel that certain songs just have to be played because of a certain reason, because of an OCD reason. My experience with objects wasn't necessarily like that. It's just, when I was a kid, to share some personal things, it would be like I would talk to my clothes and say, "Oh, hello, Mr. Shirt. I haven't worn you in a while. Well, I'm going to wear you tomorrow." Where you have this type of connection to objects that is somewhat unhealthy, where you think that certain things have to be close to you, or you have a certain appreciation for objects that isn't necessarily comprehensible to anyone other than you. And with D.B. Cooper, I could see all of that happening, and I think that that just stems from neuroticism. I mean, that's for me, it sounds like neuroticism. For Howard Stern, it sounded like neuroticism. But if D.B. Cooper was a neurotic individual, I definitely don't see too many signs of that on the plane. I mean, in D.B. Cooper's actions. And Robert Fuller even noted that. He said mostly, this guy is cool, calm, and collected. He's in control of all things. Some other points that he said in his criminal profile of Cooper are very basic. Most likely he had military training. Most likely he had tactical training and survival training. And I think that these things are widely accepted. A lot of people believe that D.B. Cooper served in the military, maybe the Army, maybe the Air Force, and maybe even the Navy. And he had some experience with aviation. So I can comprehend that, and I don't necessarily think that this is out of this world. But in terms of creating a criminal profile, lots of people have tried to do this for D.B. Cooper. And some of you will remember that I talked about Pat Brown's criminal profile for D.B. Cooper, and it was just in complete contrast to Robert Fuller's, because she was saying just almost everything the opposite of what I've just shared with you. And that is that she thought that D.B. Cooper had no military experience, that he worked in the aerospace sector, particularly for a company like Boeing. She thought that D.B. Cooper was a Canadian citizen who had mixed Caucasian and First Nation ancestry, and that he learned about the Dan Cooper comics because of the French language connections in Canada, crossed the border, did the skyjacking, and then went back to Canada. And one thing that I think that was very different between Robert Fuller and Pat Brown is that I'm just guessing, but I think that Pat Brown was taking her experience with serial killers and trying to apply it to a skyjacker. She's written 2 books, one's called The Profiler and one's called Killing for Sport, and she has other books out there, but she's these 2 books that heavily talk about serial killers. And in Killing for Sport, I mean, she's openly saying, these are my experiences profiling serial killers, and this is how serial killers function. And what I had to learn the hard way is that the psychological profiling of skyjackers and the psychological profiling of serial killers is completely different. And I think that Robert Fuller was much more aware of this. I think that he was much more aware of these differences between the 2 types of criminals. To give some examples, a serial killer wants to unleash rage on the victim in a murderous way. I mean, serial killers, right? They want to take their unhealed childhood traumas, maybe incurable childhood traumas, partnered with deep-seated rage and bad experiences, and project those onto the victims to the point of death. Does the skyjacker want to do that? Most of the time, no. In D.B. Cooper's case, no. We do have people like the 9/11 hijackers who wanted to kill, but with the majority of the skyjackers that were studied in the mid-20th century, they don't want to do that. They don't want to actually commit murder. They want to go all the way to the edge, make it look like they are capable of murder, but in reality, they are just acting like they are going to be in control. They're not necessarily hurting anyone, they're just proving that they have the power. And this stuff was all said by Robert Fuller in his psychological profile of D.B. Cooper. What he said very specifically was, he didn't even think that Cooper would have been capable of murdering everyone on the plane. And, well, what does this stem from? If it's not like unhealed childhood trauma partnered with homicidal rage, where is it coming from? Feelings of inferiority. And this is stuff that Robert Fuller also remarked on. He said that, D.B. Cooper was probably somebody who was not the most significant person in life. He lived somewhat of an unremarkable daily life, so he wanted to use the skyjacking as a way to be in control, to give out the orders, to tell people what to do. And he's not actually going to hurt anyone. He's not planning on hurting anyone. One point where I would disagree with him is I think D.B. Cooper was capable of it. if he's making the threat and he's saying stuff like "you'll never take me alive," I think D.B. Cooper was capable of murder. But in all seriousness, I don't necessarily see these things about how the serial killer and the Skyjacker are synonymous. And I've never talked to Pat Brown about her books. We've never, spoken on anything, and definitely didn't consult with her before her D.B. Cooper episode. But I think that that's the particular mistake that she is making with her criminal profiling, and Robert Fuller was definitely more in touch with a lot of the observations. Moving on to the next segment about this kind of unremarkable personality, it's just was his opportunity to do something very big, do something very powerful, and some of the things that I've been talking to you guys about very frequently on Cooper Friday is one thing that D.B. Cooper might have been experiencing is a divorce, separation from his family, and that it's the day before Thanksgiving, and he might have been experiencing some type of loss and just frustration with his life. Robert Fuller said all of this stuff in his criminal profile. Some of the more basic things that were discussed were that D.B. Cooper was most likely a very meticulous planner, somebody who made drawings of the skyjacking beforehand. He was very possibly somebody who had mapped everything out, and I think all of that is true. I don't doubt any of that. Now, one point of contention that I would bring up is Robert Fuller was of the mindset that D.B. Cooper was most likely either from the Pacific Northwest or extremely familiar with the Pacific Northwest. The skyjacking is taking place in Oregon State and Washington State, Portland to Seattle, and I'm absolutely not convinced at all that D.B. Cooper lived in any of those areas. I think he studied them. I think he knew what he was doing. I think he had familiarity with the land. That could have been done through mapping. It could have been done through books with the atlas, or something to that effect, because one key component that we see with skyjackers is they do not mind traveling long distances. In fact, they enjoy traveling long distances. That is one of the two major commonalities that was observed by Dr. David G. Hubbard in the book The Skyjacker. Skyjackers enjoy vigorous walking and traveling long distances. It doesn't bother them. So I found that Robert Fuller was somewhat dismissive of other theories involving D.B. Cooper, such as the ones that might include Vince Peterson or Milton Vordahl, although this episode came out years ago before these suspects were widely discussed, but the concept of somebody who would be coming in from another state, like flying in, committing the skyjacking, burying the money at Tina Bar, and then coming back later, well, I absolutely think that there is nothing wrong with D.B. Cooper being from a different part of the country, because of that very reason. Skyjackers do not mind traveling long distances to commit the crime, and they don't necessarily have to do what Chael Sonnen said and commit the skyjacking in their own backyard. No, they can put more thought and effort into this. Just because it's involving Washington State and Oregon State does not mean that the skyjacker was a resident of Washington State or Oregon State. He could have come from anywhere. But it was really interesting to hear that Robert Fuller was giving his analysis as a Canadian. And I already told you that Pat Brown thought that D.B. Cooper was a Canadian, and there's the Dan Cooper comics. The Dan Cooper comics were a Franco-Belgian comic. They're French language from Belgium, but they were distributed in Canada only in French. They weren't translated into English yet in 1971. And somebody like Robert Fuller, a Canadian profiler, said he did not see any evidence that D.B. Cooper was a Canadian. And the whole thing about being of First Nation ancestry, or some people think that D.B. Cooper was part Latino, that he had Latino ancestry. Robert Fuller said something that was very strong on this when he said, no, he's not a Native American. No, he's not a First Nation. No, he's not a Latino. People know what a Latino individual looks like. D.B. Cooper was a white guy with a darker skin tone. He was a white Caucasian male with olive skin. What do you guys think about that? Can I just throw that to you as the first challenge question of the day? Do you agree or disagree with that? That D.B. Cooper was not Latino, not Native American. He was a white Caucasian male who just had a darker skin complexion. please let me know in the comments section down below. Because what was shared by Robert Fuller is that people know what Latino features look like. People know what Native American features look like, and that's not really what they're saying. The only thing that seems to go for that is the olive skin complexion for D.B. Cooper. Some white people, some white Caucasian males also have darker skin tones, darker skin complexions. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. I want to agree with that. I really do. I want to say that, yeah, that's a totally spot on, no nonsense statement. He's going down the right path. I want to agree with that. But one thing that is particularly problematic for me with that statement is it's not true. There are Latinos who are called white passing, who just have extremely pale skin. Some Latinos have extremely dark skin. And the same is going to be true for Native Americans. And this whole concept of people know what Latino features look like, no, they don't. No, they don't. I mean, have you not ever met somebody who had Latin American ancestry and you didn't know it immediately? I can give you so many examples. Also, people who work in the media business, like in film and TV, like actors. Sometimes you realize that they're a Latino only because they tell their story in an interview. And then other people could easily say the same for Native American ancestry. This whole concept of people know what Latinos look like, people know what Native Americans look like, that's not what they're saying. They're just saying that this is a white guy with a darker skin tone. I want to agree with that, but it's not factual. Yes, I get what he's saying. It's just, it's not that black and white. Wow, wonderful, wonderful. I mean, people can be fooled all the time. Let me know what you think, though. Do you think that D.B. Cooper had Latino or Native American ancestry, or do you think that he was just a white guy who was a little bit darker? Now, moving on to the next issue here on Cooper Friday. Ultimately, Robert Fuller was going to settle on a suspect named Wolfgang Gossett. And Wolfgang Gossett is one that I've spoken very highly of in the past. He is one whom I have said is my dark horse. I've said that many times. Maybe there isn't the most evidence that he was D.B. Cooper, but I called him the dark horse because it's still entirely possible. And I know so many people are thinking, well, it's most likely that we're going to have a suspect who was completely under the radar, who was never found. And all of the widely discussed suspects are wrong, maybe, but as I understand, Ryan Burns is going to be revealing a new person of interest at the most recent CooperCon, or the newest CooperCon that's going to be coming out in about 1 month's time, so we're all going to be paying attention. But he said Wolfgang Gossett is his suspect. Wolfgang Gossett is a fascinating individual. He was in the military. He was stationed in France, actually. And that could be the connection to the Dan Cooper comics there. Someone who was living in France with the military nonetheless, learning about the stories of this hero paratrooping pilot. That could easily tie into something like that, as well as the James Bond complex, where somebody could walk up to the counter saying Cooper, Dan Cooper, the way that someone would say Bond, James Bond. Somebody's trying to act out the fantasy when they're acting like this comic book character. And furthermore, Wolfgang Gossett did confess to have been D.B. Cooper. He reportedly had a safety deposit box in Vancouver, Canada with some mysterious contents. And moreover, he talked to multiple people about these confessions, and they were even attorneys. And this is something that Robert Fuller also thought that D.B. Cooper would have done, where he would have held on to this knowledge for a little while, but he had to tell someone. And this is something where I'm a little bit on the fence, but I can also use the same card that I played once in this episode, saying, I want to agree with that, but I don't necessarily know if that's true. And that is that, would D.B. Cooper confess to somebody? D.B. Cooper commits the skyjacking, gets the $200,000 at the end of his life, tells somebody, I was D.B. Cooper. Well, about 900 people have already done that, so how do we know that Wolfgang Gossett's confession is legitimate? And I think that this is really tying into something that is very, very problematic. I mean, we have Dwayne Weber confessing on his deathbed to being D.B. Cooper, more or less for all intents and purposes. Walter Recca confessing on tape. So with somebody like Wolfgang Gossett, I want to think that there's some validity to the confessions, but in other terms, I think that I have some doubts, because just because somebody says they did it, it doesn't mean that they actually did it. But what would the real D.B. Cooper do? Would he take that secret to the grave? I'm leaning toward no. I'm leaning toward no, D.B. Cooper would not want to take that to the grave because during the actions of the skyjacking, during the act of the skyjacking, he didn't kill anyone. If anything, he's being cool, calm, and collected. He's just sipping bourbon and smoking cigarettes, and he got the money, he got the parachutes, and he made a getaway. Yes, I think he would tell somebody that. Now, sometimes we have serial killers who take things to the grave, but what have I already told you in this episode? Skyjackers and serial killers do not think in the same ways. Not all the time. I mean, okay, not all the time, right? So I think that D.B. Cooper probably told somebody, and is that what Wolfgang Gossett's story is all about? Now, Robert Fuller brought up something, and that was the biggest challenge to Wolfgang Gossett, that somebody online said that Wolfgang Gossett was most likely not D.B. Cooper because of too much BS. And the profiler didn't like that at all. He's like, well, what does that mean? And I'm glad he brought that up, because I have already told you, I think highly of Wolfgang Gossett as a D.B. Cooper suspect, but I think that that is a perfect way of putting it. I've never used those exact terms, too much BS. And the reasons why I have doubts about Wolfgang Gossett is he was a wild storyteller. He also went on to host a radio show about paranormal activity, so he's also fascinated with other wild stories. Maybe you believe in the paranormal, maybe you don't, but they are wild stories nonetheless. And also, he has made multiple confessions partnered with the other 900 people who have made confessions. So, all of that stuff goes into the category of BS. And I mean, yes, there are reasons to doubt him. And I told you, he's one of my top suspects, one of the strongest suspects for me, out of the whole myriad of D.B. Cooper suspects. But I still have doubts for that exact reason. I've never used that phraseology before, that he's full of too much BS. But that's definitely something to keep in mind. Because when we attach ourselves to certain theories, like if I say that Wolfgang Gossett is my dark horse suspect, and then I'm faced with contradictory evidence, I have to admit it. Everybody has to admit it. Otherwise, it's just dishonesty. You're just not being honest to solving the mystery. So let me know what you think about Wolfgang Gossett as a D.B. Cooper suspect. And I do want to share something with you guys. Maybe the most fascinating thing from Robert Fuller's appearance on the Cooper Vortex and in his criminal profile, and that is that D.B. Cooper did not own the tie. D.B. Cooper left behind his clip-on tie with the mother-of-pearl tie clip, and Robert Fuller does not believe that that was owned by D.B. Cooper, and he means that yes, it was in Cooper's possession, yes, it was Cooper's tie, yes, he left it behind, but he left it behind because it was not something that he regularly wore. It was not something that he regularly owned. Now, how did he obtain it? You guys know all the usual explanations. Thrift store, borrowed it, stole it, pulled it out of his friend's closet. You guys know those types of explanations, and it wasn't exactly specified as to how D.B. Cooper obtained the tie, but that's what was discussed. I mean, like, that was just what was discussed. That it was not Cooper's tie, because Robert Fuller was of the mindset that D.B. Cooper has this type of infatuation with objects, that he wants them to be close to him, and he does not want to part with them. Even to the point where he said that D.B. Cooper was the type of person that probably would have rather lose the money than lose one of his personal objects. And this tends to tie back to security, I think, which, I mean, again, to me that sounds like high neuroticism. And I have a few doubts about that, but I want to follow his train of thought first. And that's that he has this obsession with objects where he just wants to keep them close to him. He doesn't want to lose things that are his, and it's an unhealthy obsession. So if that were the tie that he wore regularly in his personal life, he wouldn't jump without it. It wouldn't be the whole concept of, oh, well, he's getting ready to jump out of a plane. Maybe he has other things on his mind. Maybe he wanted to put the tie in his pocket and then He just jumped and he forgot about it because he was thinking about other stuff. Robert Fuller was met with that challenge, and he openly stated that he's like, no, I don't think he would have been capable of that. He wouldn't have left behind something that was his personal property because he wants everything that's his to stay close to him. And firstly, what does this mean if the tie is not D.B. Cooper's? That all of these investigations into the tie might be going down the wrong path. They're not baseless, they're not fruitless, they're not meaningless. Maybe they might help. But it doesn't necessarily mean that D.B. Cooper was somebody who got rare metallic elements on his tie because of his job. That's it. And that's what this guy is pushing. That's what Robert Fuller was pushing, because he was thinking that, if it's a second-hand tie, maybe the metallic elements got onto the tie because of somebody else's job, somebody else's career. And all of these explorations into the tie might be skewed. And that whole statement that was brought up by Eric Eulis, if you can't explain the tie, he's not the guy, then that is an incorrect statement. It was a second-hand purchase. It was something that was taken, and it's not actually tracing back to this individual's occupation. You can always let me know what you think about that. I love talking about the tie in the comments down below. And there is one additional point, though, that I would like to discuss with you in regards to the actions and activities of D.B. Cooper, and this relates to the Tina Bar money find, because maybe I got a little bit ahead of myself, because one point that I absolutely disagreed with was that D.B. Cooper wouldn't come from a place like Pennsylvania or maybe Tennessee, like with Joe Lackich, to commit the skyjacking. I think that's totally normal. But I do not like the claim that D.B. Cooper would have buried the money at Tina Bar on the night of the skyjacking, then left and come back months later to reclaim the money, and he left behind 3 bundles at Tina Bar, and that's how the money was found in 1980. That part I do not like, and Robert Fuller dismissed that aspect of the traveling Cooper theory, and I really don't know why that's too widely discussed. I really don't. There are multiple ways that could have happened. D.B. Cooper did not live in Washington or Oregon, okay? So he flies into Portland. Then he gets the plane ticket to Seattle. He does the skyjacking. He lands somewhere near the Lewis River. He could have taken a boat to Tina Bar. He could have taken a vehicle to Tina Bar. He could have gone on foot to Tina Bar even. Why not, right? It would take him forever, but he could do something like that. And then he buries the money there. And then he comes back months later to reclaim it. And I really don't know who is a strong believer in that theory, but I do not believe that D.B. Cooper would have buried the money at Tina Bar and expected to come back months later, because it's next to a freaking river, for the love of God. That would be a terrible thing to do. It's just idiotic. Now, Eric Eulis has talked about this, saying that it wasn't months, but days later, I think is what he has said, or maybe not the night of, but he buried the money and then he came back the next day, or then a few days later, or sometime in that time frame. That's a little bit more reasonable, but it still begs the question of why on earth would somebody do that so close to a river, which could flood at any time. I don't care how good you are at reading weather reports, you cannot predict the weather 8 days in advance, because it could be catastrophic. So that could have greatly affected his plans. What if the entire burial scene near Tina Bar was just underwater? I just think that would cause so many complications, as opposed to burying the money on dry ground in a more secure location that could be marked by a very specific signature. I think that Tina Bar is a terrible place to bury the money, but I do believe that at some point somebody came back and planted the $6,000, and Robert Fuller was also of that mindset, that the money was intentionally buried at Tina Bar, but for a different reason. So I'm mostly in agreement with his observations about Tina Bar. I disagree that D.B. Cooper would not have traveled from another state or even gone across the country for the skyjacking. But overall, it was a fascinating interview on the Cooper Vortex. I love what Darren Schaefer does with his interviews and all of the guests that he finds. If you have not subscribed to the Cooper Vortex here on YouTube, I invite you to do so. But of course, the Cooper Vortex is always strong on the podcast circuit as well. And I've been a guest in the past. Darren has also been a guest on this show. And as I understand, he will be the MC for the upcoming CooperCon in November. This episode is being recorded in October. And of course, you can always like and subscribe to Black Box Online Radio if you want to follow along with Cooper Friday. I also talk about other subjects, such as the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and the Black Dahlia, coming out Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, respectively. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And right now I would like to switch into the Cooper Profile segment. Normally, on Cooper Friday, I talk to you guys about a subject that is not related to profiling, and then I conclude the episode with the Cooper Profile segment where I look at the writings of Dr. David G. Hubbard, and sometimes a different source in the world of psychology. I am not a psychologist. I am not a profiler. But at the end of the year, I was hoping to make my own original profile for D.B. Cooper. It would be the first time that I've ever done that completely. I've done like a partial profile for the Zodiac Killer. But I am fascinated with this stuff, and I do read a lot about these different writers, thinkers, psychologists, and profilers, and I also listen to a lot of them. And the Skyjacker by Dr. David G. Hubbard is a book that needs to be read very carefully. It's very dense, and it's very technical. And the things that I've been going through recently, in the most recent chapter, relate to how somebody may have experienced abuse when they were a kid, and then it can turn into rage. And sometimes it is murderous rage. Let me be clear. Some Skyjackers do have murderous rage, and that is acknowledged by Dr. David G. Hubbard, but most of them do not. Most of them do exactly what I said. They want to be in control. His verbiage, which I've said many times on the channel, is they flirt with the idea of hurting people, but they don't actually hurt people. But there are case examples in the Skyjacker of people who do have murderous ideation. So the things that I've been going through recently is that a lot of this stems from the upbringing. And very frequently I've told you that a Skyjacker regularly has an alcoholic father and an overly religious mother. And Dr. David G. Hubbard has finally provided an interpretation of that data. And that states that in the majority of cases that he studied, the father acts as the disciplinarian, and the mother acts as the ultimate authority figure. But that means that the father is the one giving out the punishments. He's doing the discipline, but he's not the authority figure. And this is how a child perceives the actions and behaviors of their parents, and then uses it as a model for their daily life. And this ultimately turns into what Dr. David G. Hubbard calls virtue equals life without responsibility. And then it really gives them this type of warped sense of reality about how they're going to be navigating the world, because the authority figure in life isn't the person who is in charge of the discipline. Next, a lot of these parental relationships are not very good. A lot of these marriages are not very good. And in almost all of the cases of the Skyjacker, the mother sits down with the son or daughter and just badmouths the father. It's referred to as the wailing wall, that she's just complaining about the father all the time, doesn't like his behavior, he's bad for this reason. And then the person that she's bad-mouthing all the time is the one who's giving out the punishments. So this also affects somebody's moral compass, the way they see the world. And one of the most interesting things about this segment in the book, The Skyjacker, is, so far I've told you about 16 stories of different Skyjackers. Very famously, Dr. David G. Hubbard would use a sample of 20 for his research. So far, I've been through the stories of 16 different Skyjackers, and In 15 of them, there was a falling out with the father. The father was either deceased, deserted the family, or he was no longer part of the child's life. And I say child, they could be an adult at that point, and he had just given up on life. He's not participating. The term whipped by life is used in the book. And this is really interesting because in a lot of these cases, it happens 1 to 2 years before the skyjacking. Of course, some people are deserted by their fathers when they are 10 or 11 years old. The father is very abusive up until the age of 10 or 11 and then just walks away from the family and never comes again. And in at least one instance, the father divorces the mother 1 to 2 years before the skyjacking. So there is some type of separation from the father in life. Think about what I said. Virtue equals life without responsibility. Well, the disciplinarian in their life is no longer present. The authority figure in their life is no longer present. And it seems like with some people, that becomes a trigger mechanism to launch the skyjacking. That becomes something that sets people off and sets people into these pathways in the sky when they want to do this. And one thing that Robert Fuller is most likely correct on is that he's saying that Cooper felt unremarkable. He was somebody who was not really very good at standing up for himself. He lived an ordinary life, and he wanted to use this as an opportunity to make himself feel more remarkable. He wanted to use this as an opportunity to make himself feel more powerful. And yes, he wanted the money. Now, I'm glad Robert Fuller said this because he's like, Cooper asked for the money, $200,000. Very clearly, Cooper wanted the money, but he also wanted other things. He also was fascinated by the airplanes themselves. He was also somebody who had a certain sense of symbology that was attributed to the airplane, and I think all of that stuff is fitting in very neatly with the Skyjacker, because that's what it seems to be about, that this crime is a heist. It is definitely done for profit, but there's a very specific reason why people are committing skyjackings, and that's what Dr. David G. Hubbard was trying to uncover. Well, why a plane? Why the sky? Fascinations with aviation. It's what the plane represents. Flying above the earth, jumping out, and also this type of rebirth that we talked about in last week's episode. Before they weren't a skyjacker, now they are a skyjacker. All of that stuff comes together with these observations that are made by Robert Fuller and David Hubbard. Okay, though, so in terms of the way that D.B. Cooper would be operating, I think that this goes against certain suspects who were making a statement in certain theories, like with Joe Lackage, Barb Dayton, and last week I was talking to you about James Klansnick. These suspects were mostly accused of committing the skyjacking because they wanted to make a personal statement. It's a giant FU to the authority figures. And that doesn't necessarily seem to be the way that skyjackers are operating. It's somebody who hit a low point in life. Maybe they lost connections with their father. Maybe they were not bound to have any more type of discipline in their lives. The disciplinarian in their life was no longer present. They lived an unremarkable life they thought that they could not achieve. So what was the answer? Commit the skyjacking. Risk it all, and you either succeed and become a skyjacker who got away like D.B. Cooper, or you fail and you become a reborn person who is a failed skyjacker. So let me know what you think about any of those observations. And one final thing that was made by Robert Fuller on his appearance on the Cooper Vortex is that he also points out that D.B. Cooper was somebody who was very, very prone to compromise. D.B. Cooper compromised a lot when, say for example, he gets the money in a bank bag when he wanted a knapsack, and he accepted it. He said that he wanted the Boeing 727 to take off with the aft staircase down, and they said, no, we can't do that. Well, he could have just told them, try anyway, or I'll blow the plane up, but he accepted that. And another thing that has been very consistent with skyjackers is they are not the oldest and not the youngest in the family most of the time. They are somewhat in the middle of the birth order, like if there are 4 children, maybe second born or third born, and I could easily see how D.B. Cooper grew up in a family where he wasn't the oldest, he wasn't the youngest, he's a middle child, Not the third, not like the middle child of three, like he's the second born the way that I am. I have an older sister and a younger sister. Not like that. But in a larger family where you had to do what? You had to compromise because there wasn't enough to go around. I could easily see that taking place. But let me know what you think about any of these observations. What do you think about this statement that 15 out of 16 Skyjackers had a falling out with their father? Do you think that that's something we would find in D.B. Cooper? Do you think that D.B. Cooper was divorced or separated from his family before Thanksgiving, and that he just thought that he was at the end of his rope? He had nothing else to live for, so it was time to commit the skyjacking, time for an attempt at glory, because everything in his life had failed. He's not trying to make a personal statement about, oh, well, I feel betrayed by my business or the company that I worked for, or I don't get to live out my dream of being a commercial aviation pilot, or I want revenge on the FBI, like some of these theories. No, it's just, I feel like a failure. So what am I going to do? I'm not going to get whipped by life. I am going to take control of it. And how is he going to take control of it? By putting dynamite into a briefcase, demanding $200,000 and 4 parachutes, and then jumping out over the Pacific Northwest, never to be seen or heard from again. What do you think about any of that? Please let me know in the comments section down below. I would love to read your comments, and usually on Cooper Friday, you guys always say great things. That will be all for me now, and everybody have a wonderful weekend. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You're listening to YouTube right now, Black Box Online Radio, unless you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, but you can also view the shorts on YouTube under Black Box Online Radio. On Facebook, I now use the Black Box Online Radio Facebook page to release the shorts, and of course there is blackboxned88 on Instagram. And you can also view the images that you see going by on the screen. They are available at True Crime Designs on Facebook. That's where they're archived. And if you just want to follow along with a true crime page, I invite you to check out True Crime Designs on Facebook. And you know about buymeacoffee.com, but really, just everybody have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you on Monday for a new episode about the Zodiac Killer. Until next time.